Today is 6th December, and I'm going to suggest that the last 24 hours have not only confirmed the trends in the Ukraine conflict over the last few weeks, they have in fact solidified those trends, and that it's now becoming increasingly clear that we are in the end game of Project Ukraine. The plan that was cobbled together by the Western powers over the course of the autumn of 2021 and the winter of 2022 to leverage the war in Ukraine, a conflict in Ukraine, to create a political and economic and potentially military crisis in Moscow in order eventually to force the removal from power of President Putin and his government. That project is now on the brink of collapse, and there is now real risk, a real possibility that the state of Ukraine might be pulled down with it. Now, many things have happened over the last 24 hours. There's been actually some very important news on the battlefront, but in some respects, the politics, the political events are the most important. And the most important of those, by far, is the collapse of bipartisan support for funding in Ukraine, which it became clear over the course of yesterday has now become conclusive. Just a few weeks ago, at roughly the time of President Zelensky's visit to the United States, it seemed that opposition to funding for Ukraine was limited to roughly 100 Republican representatives in the House of Representatives and perhaps 10 or so Republican senators in the Senate. It now seems as if the entire Republican Party has solidified and has closed ranks against further funding for Ukraine. And it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that the reason for this is not just the failure of Ukraine's offensive, but also the mood, the growing mood in the White House, in the administration, in the military community, that the war in Ukraine is now being lost, and that the time has therefore come for the United States to distance itself as quickly as it can from the coming debacle, with more and more Republican senators and congressmen now looking to do precisely that, and in order to preserve their own positions ahead of the pending elections. So what did actually happen yesterday? What did happen in Washington yesterday? The first thing to say is that it seems as if the administration has been working overtime with Chuck Schumer, the lead Democrat Party senator in the Senate, to try to get the Senate to vote an appropriation, a big appropriation for Ukraine. Perhaps this $61 billion appropriation for Ukraine that President Biden requested back in October. And a few weeks ago, the prospects of getting the Senate to vote for that might have looked good. Several Republican senators, some of the dominant Republican senators, the Republican establishment in the Senate, people like Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, Mitt Romney, were all fully signed up at that time to Project Ukraine. Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham had meetings with Zelensky when he visited the United States. Mitch McConnell even made a a somewhat astonishing set of comments, which he will now no doubt regret and perhaps try to get us all to forget, that for Republicans the most important, the greatest, most urgent priority of all was to keep supporting Ukraine. So once it would have looked that bar a small minority of senators, most of the Senate, Republican senators, most of the Senate, all the Democrat senators, who are the majority, and most of the Republican senators would have voted this appropriations package for Ukraine. And that would have put significant pressure on Republicans in the House of Representatives. The Republicans in the House of Representatives have a bare majority in the House. It's a majority nonetheless, but it's a small one. And if most of the senators, the Republican senators in the Senate, had voted a appropriation for Ukraine, the pressure on House Republicans to do the same would have been very great indeed. And of course, Speaker Johnson and the other Republican leaders in the House would have been worried that in that event, if they'd continued to hold out when the spending bill came before the House, some Republican representatives would have broken away and would have voted for the spending package, and it would have passed, and the divisions within the Republican Party would have been highlighted. Well, what happened yesterday is that, so far as I can see, the entire Republican Party, all the senators, all the Republican senators in the Senate, agreed that this spending bill for Ukraine should not pass. And that included people like Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, and Mitt Romney. And they all went along with this ploy that Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, who is increasingly clear, is a much more canny operator than most people appreciated when he was elected. They went along with this actually rather clever letter that Speaker Johnson made, sent to the President just 2 days ago, in which Johnson said that there's no fundamental, principled objection to providing funding for Ukraine. But given the realities of the situation in Ukraine now, Republicans do need to know what exactly it is that they're supposed to be voting for, what all this funding is intended to achieve. Ukraine has received almost unlimited funding from the United States for the last year and a half, and it is now losing the war. And the Republicans have not heard from the administration any coherent plan for the way forward, any plan that would take Ukraine to victory. So that was one thing that Johnson said. And by the way, just to make it clear, in all of those points, he's absolutely right. Ukraine has received huge amounts of funding. It has failed to defeat the Russians. It is in fact now losing to the Russians. There's no clear explanation why another $61 billion is going to change the situation in Ukraine, how that's going to turn the whole situation in Ukraine round. And the Biden administration has indeed, as I have pointed out in program after program, provided no coherent plan. The last plan that the Biden administration had for victory in Ukraine was Ukraine's summer offensive. That has failed, and there is no plan to take its place. Everything has been tried up to this point, and nothing has succeeded. But of course, Johnson, canny operator as he is, has also gone a step further, because of course he's linked the question of aid for Ukraine to funding, not just funding apparently, but for a complete restructuring of American policy, US government policy, with respect to immigration, illegal immigration, and control of the border. Something that the Republicans know is popular with their electoral base, and indeed with many people in the United States. And of course, Johnson is now saying that he insists upon, not just promises, that the administration will do something in respect of the southern border and immigration policy. He actually wants positive action, steps to be taken that the Republicans can rely upon before they vote for this aid. And this is something that the administration would find, I think, all but impossible to do. To say it straightforwardly, I think Democrats, including many members of the Democratic Party base, are more concerned about allowing immigration to continue than they are to support Ukraine. And I think that if the administration, if President Biden were to agree to these Republican demands, then I think his chances of re-election would become, to put it mildly, impossibly slim. So, for the moment at least, the administration is holding back from making that kind of commitment. And the Republicans in the Senate, those who a few weeks ago were saying that the support for Ukraine, American support for Ukraine, was the priority for Republicans, all of those Republicans, Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, Mitt Romney, they're all uniting behind these issues, these points made by Johnson. They all agree that an aid package, a further aid package for Ukraine, must come with a plan, an actual plan for what it is intended to do, and for actual concrete commitments by the administration to try to stem the flow of immigration into the United States. Now, I am not saying definitely that this position will hold. In the United States, there's always huge amounts of horse trading. It's often the case that people appear to take inflexible positions, and then right at the last minute, some kind of a deal is done. And for all I know, that is what will happen this time. We have apparently some 9 days left before Congress rises on the 15th of December, which in politics, 9 days seems like a very long time indeed, can be a very long time indeed. All sorts of things can happen in 9 days. And it's not impossible that some kind of a deal will be done. Maybe the administration will limit its aid requests for Ukraine. Maybe the Republicans will be persuaded to soften their position on immigration as well. It's not impossible that an aid package will be done. Bear in mind that I think that for Johnson and people like him, one of the reasons they've taken the stance they've had is not because of Ukraine, which I think is largely incidental to this, but because they have been conducting what is in effect a civil war within the Republican Party. And Mike Johnson and those who think like him on the populist wing of the Republican Party might very well feel that with Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, and Mitt Romney swinging round to their point of view, they've actually now won the big battle in the civil war, which is probably what they really mostly care about. But for the moment at least, things are stuck. And to be very clear, if Ukraine were indeed on a trajectory of victory, or alternatively, if Republican senators and Congress people really felt that for the United States, Ukraine was indeed an existential issue and one that needed to be defended at all costs, we would not be in this situation where aid for Ukraine has become a subject of horse trading in this kind of way. In that case, they would be voting for it and they would be finding other issues to argue with the administration about. The fact that they've chosen this one shows that Ukraine, despite what Mitch McConnell said all those weeks ago, for Republicans is emphatically not a priority, that they care much more about other things, and that if Ukraine does go down, well, as Johnson said, they'll be sorry, but it's no great big deal for them. So, just saying. Now, the optics of this for the administration and for the Ukrainian government have been absolutely disastrous. We've had a whole succession of US officials, President Biden's spokesman, Jake Sullivan, Janet Yellen, all making speeches, writing letters to Congress, to the Senate. I discussed an extraordinary letter that President Biden's budget director had put together and sent to Congress also. They've all been feverishly lobbying Congress to vote through this package on Ukraine. They've all been saying the same thing, that there is almost no money left now to continue to fund Ukraine, that the United States' ability to continue to fund Ukraine is now almost exhausted, that funding will have to stop in December or perhaps January, with disastrous consequences for Ukraine if Congress doesn't vote for more funding now. And of course, the Ukrainians have been lobbying as well. We've had comments from Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff, from Mikhailo Podolyak, his chief advisor. They've been also coming forward saying that Ukraine faces an absolutely disastrous situation if American aid, both military and financial, which is what is now involved, is cut off, that Yermak has actually given an explicit warning that if US aid is cut off, Ukraine might lose the war. And of course, we had information yesterday that no less a person than President Zelensky himself was going to address the senators in a virtual meeting. There was going to be a virtual meeting with the senators, and he was going to address them. Well, the meeting itself, this Senate meeting, seems to have been, which the administration and Schumer brought together seems to have been an absolute disaster. Several Republicans walked out of it. They were so unhappy, apparently, with the administration's presentation, its inability to provide either assurances over immigration or a coherent plan for Ukraine. Interestingly, one of the people who walked out was Mitt Romney, and someone seems to have tipped off Zelensky that this meeting was going to go badly wrong and that it was in his interests, therefore, to stay away rather than become associated, caught up with this shambles, so that at the last moment he cancelled his intended presentation to the senators, something which, by the way, I think will have annoyed some of the Republican senators even more. But anyway, that's a matter for another day. So, the result is we have no aid package. And though, to repeat again, it's not impossible that one might materialize over the next few days, the odds against it are now starting to grow. If there is no aid package voted for Ukraine by the 15th of December, as increasingly seems possible, then as I understand it, Congress rises. It will not be able to return to this issue before February. And of course, by that point, the situation for Ukraine on the battlefronts is going to become absolutely disastrous, and loss of confidence for Ukraine and its economic situation is going to grow. One of the points, by the way, that the Ukrainians were making, one of the specific points that Janet Yellen was making, was that it's not just American aid, that is direct American aid, which is now at risk. If the Americans are not providing funding, then it will be impossible for agencies like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to continue with funding as well. Now, by the way, here, as a brief aside, I ought to say that the International Monetary Fund has played a deplorable role in this whole Ukrainian affair. Back in 2014, Ukraine defaulted on a $3 billion loan that it should have paid. It was required, I think it was 2014, 2015, which it ought to have repaid, paid back to the Russians. The Ukrainians have managed to prolong litigation on this issue in London to incredible lengths, and the British courts have made extraordinary decisions, in my opinion, over the course of that litigation. I'm not going to go into the details of this now. But the moment it became clear that Ukraine was not going to repay its loan to the Russians, and this was, bear in mind, back in 2015, at that point, the IMF ought to have stopped lending. Well, they disregarded their own rules. They continued lending. They've continued lending to Ukraine ever since, even as the situation there has imploded, even as Ukraine's economy has, even Ukrainian officials themselves admit now, has been reduced to a hollow shell. The IMF's purpose, its stated role, was not to provide funding to a country at war. That was absolutely not its designed purpose, but that is what it has done. But anyway, it seems that if American aid is withheld, even the IMF will have to stop funding Ukraine. And then, of course, the whole situation with the economy will simply unravel, which, for the record, and just to finish on this, given its fragility, the IMF should never have lent to it in the first place. But anyway, that's an aside. Well, all of that, if we're to believe Yellen and what people like Yermak and Podolyak and Zelensky himself are saying, all of that will no doubt start to crystallize around January, February. And of course, with the situation in Ukraine deteriorating even further, with the military situation deteriorating even further over the January-February period, with the economy, the Ukrainian economy perhaps plunging towards collapse, well, the willingness, the desire in Congress to continue to fund this bankrupt and failing enterprise will presumably grow rather than diminish, making it most unlikely that there would be a turnaround in February next year. Well, that already is bad enough. That is very bad news for President Zelensky and his government and for the Ukrainian war effort. They must be praying and hoping that something will change between now and the 15th of December. That is not impossible, as I said. The administration is now pulling out all the stops. It's saying that if Ukraine does indeed go down over the next few weeks and months, it'll be the Republicans who are to blame because they didn't provide Ukraine with the funding that it needed. I suspect most Republicans will ignore that. They will consider that an empty threat. They know the reality that Ukraine is going down anyway, and they probably calculate that their base will be more angry with them if they continue to vote funding for Ukraine and it goes down anyway. Then the base would be, if they stop providing funding for Ukraine and allowed it simply to go under. So I think that's probably the hard-headed calculation that most Republicans in Congress are making now. There is no votes, in other words, from Republicans, both in Congress and in the country, for money for what most of them no doubt see as Joe Biden's war. So that is already a potential disaster for Ukraine and for President Zelensky and his government. But if we believe a report I saw on one of the Ukrainian Telegram channels, from memory, I think it was Resident, but it might have been Legitimi, the situation for Zelensky is getting even worse from a political perspective. And here, before I discuss what this particular Telegram channel said, I want to make it clear that my belief is that these two Telegram channels, Legitimi and Resident, are essentially controlled by General Zaluzhny. Because this report, which, for the record, by the way, I should say I read on Slavyangrad, but which undoubtedly is a real report from this Ukrainian Telegram channel. Anyway, this report said that there'd been a meeting between General Zaluzhny and top officials from Zelensky's team. I got the impression that Zelensky himself did not participate in this meeting. It seems that relations between Zelensky and Zaluzhny have broken down so completely that they are unable to speak with each other, and apparently don't even want to meet with each other anymore. But anyway, the report claimed that the people from Zelensky's team passed on to Zaluzhny a request for his resignation. He was apparently told, I gather Yermak participated in this meeting, he was apparently told that Zelensky has completely lost all confidence in Zaluzhny, and that in light of that, he should resign, and following his resignation, he should cease all further involvement in Ukrainian politics. And something astonishing then happened, because Zaluzhny, receiving a direct request from the president of Ukraine, who is his superior and commander-in-chief, after having been told by the officials of the president, representing the president, that he has lost the president's confidence, that the overall commander-in-chief, Zelensky, no longer has confidence in him and wants him to go. Zaluzhny refused to go. He refused to resign. He said defiantly that he saw no reason why he should resign, that he'd been a competent and successful general. Some of us might take issue with that. But anyway, he said that he'd been a competent and successful general and overall general in overall command of the Ukrainian military, that he'd achieved victories on the battlefield. I presume he's referring to the offensives last year in Kharkiv and Kherson region, and that his actions on the battlefield have spared the lives of many Ukrainian soldiers. And Zaluzhny then went on to say that not only would he not resign, but if Zelensky took the decision to sack him, well, in that case, Zelensky would bear the consequences. In other words, a straightforward threat. Now, this, especially in the middle of a war, is insubordination of an extreme kind. When Yevgeny Prigozhin earlier this year started to crank up his statements, his criticisms of the Russian Defense Ministry, of Sergei Shoigu, and of Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff, I pointed out at the time how grossly insubordinate in the middle of a war those comments were. And of course, in the event, what eventually happened is that these comments escalated to the point where Prigozhin actually led some of his men in a mutiny, attempting to march on Moscow in order, as he said, to force the resignation or dismissal of Shoigu and Gerasimov, a mutiny that failed catastrophically. Well, in my opinion, if Zaluzhny's words are being reported accurately, and as I said already, the two Telegram channels, one of which reported this conversation, are, in my opinion, not just sympathetic to Zaluzhny, but probably controlled by him. They've been sniping at Zelensky now for over a year. They've been building up Zaluzhny as the voice of reason and sanity in the Ukrainian military and political leadership. They've been basically rooting for Zaluzhny in ways that clearly signal that they are supportive of him in this conflict between him and Zelensky. Anyway, if this conversation is being reported accurately, then the insubordination, the defiance on Zaluzhny's part goes far beyond anything that Prigozhin did over the course of his feud with Shoigu and Gerasimov. He is, in effect, refusing a direct request, not yet an order, but a request from his commander-in-chief, and he is insisting on remaining in post even after being told that he no longer has the confidence and trust of his commander-in-chief. And going even further than that, he is in effect threatening his commander-in-chief with consequences if his commander-in-chief takes the decision to sack him. Now, that is defiance on an unheard of scale. It would be pretty extraordinary coming from a civilian official to the president, but from a military official, from Ukraine's top military commander to the president, to the overall commander-in-chief. Such defiance, in effect, goes beyond insubordination. It almost amounts to a mutiny. And unsurprisingly, it seems that Zelensky's officials, the ones who met with Zaluzhny, came away from the meeting absolutely furious, and that there is now absolute fury about Zaluzhny within Zelensky's team. Now, I have to say that if this report is true, and again I repeat, my belief is that the Telegram channel that reported it has some kind of connection directly to Zaluzhny himself. Well, as somebody who has studied coups on many occasions and who as a child actually lived through one, and when I say lived through one, I was at the absolute epicenter of the events which took place in Greece in April 1967. The military actually came to our residence. They wanted to arrest one of their political enemies who they knew would be there, who was, of course, my father. I've spoken to people in Greece, both those who opposed the coup at the time and some of the people who participated in it, though at a middle and lower level. I could say that somebody who both lived through a coup and experienced it, and who has observed and followed coups in many places and has read about them in history, I would say that this step of Zaluzhny's, if it has been reported properly, could almost be seen as the first step in a coup. The military chief is telling the president that he's going to remain in post, that he doesn't care whether or not the president trusts him, he's going to make his own decisions regardless of what the president wants, and that he's presumably prepared to take steps to protect his position, which is what effectively that threat to the president amounted to. Now, I'm not exactly sure that Zaluzhny at this moment in time, in terms of threats, is thinking about deploying troops and tanks to Kiev, arresting Zelensky, doing all those sort of things that classical coups involve, things that I actually personally remember from the events in Greece in April 1967. But it could be, for example, that he's thinking of leading a personal political movement against Zelensky. It could be that he's going to talking about putting himself at the head of a protest movement, or that he's going to try to maneuver, perhaps with the Americans, to get elections going. But this is nonetheless extraordinary and dramatic stuff. And unless Zelensky is able to assert his authority and dismiss Zaluzhny, which is what he must now do, then in effect, power in Ukraine will start to transfer from Zelensky and the civilians around him to Zaluzhny himself, and we could start to see Zaluzhny increasingly taking it upon himself to make not just military but political decisions as well. So we will see what happens and what Zaluzhny does and what Zelensky does, and no doubt we'll be getting eventual confirmation of whether these reports of this conversation are true. I would point out that I've been reading about bitter arguments between Zaluzhny and Zelensky since the summer of last year. For many, many months, the existence of these arguments was denied. But of course, nobody any longer doubts that those arguments were real. And we see the extent to which the relationship between Zaluzhny and Zelensky has now publicly broken down. Now, I think I am going to go one further step and discuss what might happen if Zaluzhny does indeed assume control, either indirectly because Zelensky will have been so completely marginalized that he will be president in name only, or after Zelensky attempts to sack Zaluzhny, enabling Zaluzhny to take full and formal control of the government through whatever legal political process he perhaps has in mind. What might Zaluzhny do? Well, a member of the Duran community with whom I've corresponded in the past has reminded me of something that Zaluzhny said when he had that interview with The Economist last year. In fact, I remember noticing this comment that he made then in that interview and talking about it. Zaluzhny, and remember he said this directly after those great victories that he's now talking about, the ones in Kherson region and in Kharkiv region. He said, in effect, that he might eventually be pushed into doing what General Mannerheim, the commander-in-chief of the Finnish military, found himself forced to do in 1940 during the Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union. For a time, the Finns were able to defend successfully against the Red Army, but eventually the Red Army proved too powerful, and General Mannerheim, the commander-in-chief, eventually felt that he had no option but to tell his soldiers to stand down, to give up the battle. And that did indeed happen in 1940. And I remember thinking at the time, this was been in the autumn of 2022, that it was interesting that Zaluzhny was talking about that then. And we come back to what I've been discussing recently about a possible Appomattox courthouse scenario where Ukrainian generals start to make decisions on their own initiative without clearing them with the political leadership in Kiev decisions in effect to capitulate, to stand down. And if you think about it, what Mannerheim did in 1940 is not very different from what General Lee did in April 1865 at Appomattox courthouse. And in a sense, it's what Zaluzhny last year was floating that he might eventually do. We might be closer to that kind of moment than perhaps people realize. The very fact that Zaluzhny floated that possibility a year ago suggests that even then it was at the back of his mind that it might come about, and especially if American financial and military support does indeed end, it could be what Zaluzhny decides, that he has no alternative but to do. Certainly, the military situation, is deteriorating fast. Now, over the last 24 hours, we've had a cascade of information about what is going on the battle lines. And firstly, it seems that the Russians are making very significant progress now, both in the Liman area towards the Oskol River that I was talking about the other day, but also now in Bakhmut. Yesterday, I discussed a report on TASS about a claim that the press officer of a Russian volunteer unit had made about how the road to Chasov Yar had now been cut by the Russians. And I said I didn't really understand that very well. There's been a great deal of clarification of all of this. The best clarification, by the way, has been, for the record, provided by Dima on the Military Summary channel. He actually provides maps, which I can make some sense of. He explains where the Russians are actually advancing, the kind of places which they're pushing forward from. And it's now becoming increasingly clear that the Russians are indeed in the process of beginning their operation to capture Bogdanovka, this village beyond Khromovo, which, as I've said before, would fold, if it fell, would fold Ukrainian defenses, Ukrainian positions around Bakhmut. It would force the withdrawal of all Ukrainian forces from around Bakhmut. But significantly, the Russians also appear to be advancing north of this village. They have indeed apparently captured stretches of the road to Chasov Yar, and they are now starting to approach Chasov Yar itself. And it makes more sense to you can understand these movements better if you actually look at these maps, something I'm not able to do, but it does seem as if the Russians are now making strong progress in Bakhmut, not just they haven't just captured Khromovo, but as if the entire Ukrainian position in the northern part of Bakhmut is now hanging by a thread. And the Russians have also apparently recaptured part of the Dacha belt west of Bakhmut itself. And for the record, I was still hearing reports that the Russians continue to make progress in the hill areas around Kleshevka, somewhat to the south. So, dramatic events taking place in Bakhmut. And it seems today there have been more reports that the Russians have now begun the final operation to clear Marinka. These are sketchy reports, they might not be true, but apparently there's been a major Russian push to capture the remaining pockets of Ukrainian resistance in Marinka. They're now pressing hard on this village to the south of Marinka, Novo-Mikhailova. There's been a lot of discussion about Novo-Mikhailova. As I said, I don't fully understand its significance, but both sides seem to think that it is significant, and the Russians do seem to be in the process of storming and capturing this village. And there's been some really plaintive and alarming videos from a Ukrainian perspective coming out of Avdiivka now. There was a video from a Ukrainian soldier in Avdiivka itself. There's some questions about its authenticity. For the record, it looked perfectly authentic to me. Anyway, this soldier is now saying that the road into Avdiivka is fully under the fire control of the Russians, that the Ukrainians are having to engage in very elaborate steps to try to evacuate their wounded from Avdiivka. He spoke about a very bad, deteriorating situation in Avdiivka itself. And there's also further news that the Russians are creeping closer to the chemical plant to the northwest of Avdiivka. They're pushing towards Avdiivka from the south, and they're now systematically shelling Ukrainian positions in Berdychi, the village that lies beyond Stepovoye, suggesting that the Russians have either gained full control of this village or that they're about to do so. And Ukraine, desperately short of reserves, desperately short of troops, is now having to redeploy units from all over the battlefronts to try to stem the crisis in Avdiivka. A sign, by the way, of how important for Ukraine and its defense system Avdiivka actually is. And there's been reports that Ukrainian troops, more Ukrainian units, have had to be redeployed from the area of Rabotino, Verbovoye, to try to hold positions in Avdiivka. Boris Rozhin, the commentator known as Colonel Kassad, was talking about this. Ukrainian numbers of troops in the Rabotino, Verbovoye area are becoming fewer and fewer on the ground. The Russians have been advancing in the area of Verbovoye itself, and they're launching counterattacks, and it's been suggested that the Russians might soon gain full control of Rabotino again, and that it's perhaps only a matter of time before the Ukrainians have to give up all the gains, all the territorial gains, meager as they are, that they achieved in this area, the main focus of their summer offensive, which they achieved in this area at such inordinate cost. So, extremely difficult situation for the Ukrainians on the battlefronts. I suspect that all of this is feeding back to the United States as well, that maybe, plausibly, senators and Congress people are getting briefings about the way in which the military situation is actually playing out on the ground, and that could be hardening their view that Ukraine now is in effect a lost cause, and that it makes no more sense for the United States to continue to invest in it. So, with everything going wrong for Ukraine, even the Krinky bridgehead is apparently turning into a disaster for Ukraine. The Krinky bridgehead on the Dnieper. It's perhaps becoming increasingly urgent in Kiev for something to happen, and with growing probabilities or possibilities that US aid might be cut off, one can begin to understand why the sense of crisis in Kiev is deepening almost by the hour. Now, all of this is creating a sense of crisis, not just in Kiev. It is creating a sense of crisis in Kiev. Alexei Arestovich, Zelensky's once devoted spokesperson and chief propagandist, he's now become utterly disillusioned. He's become utterly disillusioned with the West as well. He says that Ukraine, he's actually said in a broadcast that Ukraine backed the wrong side, that it underestimated the sheer industrial might of China and Russia, and had an exaggerated sense of Western strength and resolve. Anyway, and all of which suggests that he's basically saying that Ukraine really ought to think about opting for the other side. There's other Ukrainian officials. There was a Ukrainian MP, Gerashchenko, who says that the Americans are not only washing their hands of Ukraine, but they made it absolutely clear, including to the Europeans, that they want no further discussion of NATO membership for Ukraine. A message which it has been made. Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, doesn't appear to be hearing, by the way. But anyway, that's another thing. Anyway, one can sense why there is therefore this crisis in Kiev. But there's also a sense of crisis, it seems to me, in Europe. The Europeans have got themselves into a very difficult situation. They've made enormous investment in Ukraine, and the collapse of Ukraine, the prospect of a collapse in Ukraine, is causing them increasingly to worry about the long-term American commitment to themselves. And we're now getting all kinds of flesh-creeping articles starting to appear in the European media or written by European officials, talking about the disastrous consequences if Russia were to win in Ukraine, and how the bear's appetite will grow with the eating. If Ukraine falls, then Putin will move on and try and come for other places. A minister of the Polish government has written an article to that effect in National Review, a publication associated with the neocon rhino wing of the Republican Party. There have been plenty of other such articles appearing in the European media. The claim that Putin would be coming after the Baltic states by the end of 2024 was indeed floated in that article by Gideon Rachman in the Financial Times that I was talking about. It is important to understand what these articles are really about. They are not signs that the Europeans really, genuinely believe that the Russians are going to come for them. They are part of a European campaign, an increasingly panicky European campaign, to try to get the Americans to reinvest in Project Ukraine. The Europeans are worried that if the Americans pull out, as they now show clear signs of doing, then in that case, the Europeans, having made all these enormous sacrifices for Ukraine, will be left high and dry. And European spokesmen, European political leaders, European commentators who advocated for this policy of support for Ukraine will find themselves in an increasingly difficult political position. You could see this, as I said, in article after article. There is a certain tendency to pretend that what they're really worried about is not the administration itself, but the person who might succeed it, possibly Donald Trump. But one way or the other, they are desperate to get the Americans to recommit to Project Ukraine in order to keep that project rumbling on, at least for a few more months, perhaps in order to get Europe through what is likely to be a difficult election season. And of course, there is always hope that if Project Ukraine, if the war in Ukraine can be kept going, something might turn up. There is an article today in the London Times by Roger Boyes, long-standing commentator of the London Times on world affairs, takes very much a neocon view, in my opinion, on most things. Anyway, he thinks that the Russians don't have it in them to sustain a long war, that the war economy that he imagines that Russia has become will eventually implode on itself. So just keep going for a few more months, a year or two, and eventually all the things that we wanted to happen in Russia will happen. And that's the message that they're trying to convey to the United States. This isn't the moment to give up now. Let's just stay the course and keep going, because if we don't, and Putin wins in Ukraine, all of these terrible things will happen. The Russians will march into Warsaw, they'll advance to Berlin, they'll annex Finland and the Baltic states and do all of these things. I don't think anybody seriously believes that that is so. Anyway, we shouldn't be too impressed by these articles. They are the product of people who are panicking as this whole project falls apart around them. Now, there is a solution. There is a way out. I've talked about it many times. We don't know what General Zaluzhny might do if he finds himself in the right military position, the right military and political position, to actually start real talks with the Russians. There's no evidence, as I said, that he's doing so at the moment. But what the Europeans can do is they can start negotiations themselves, and the Americans can do the same. And we've now had comments about this from Izvestia. The Russians have said that Russia is prepared to engage in talks with Ukraine, including at a venue in a Western country. And this is all explained to Izvestia by Rodion Miroshnik, who is a Russian foreign ministry official. And the article then floats possible places where negotiations might take place: Hungary, Slovakia, Turkey, India. We discussed in various programs on the Duran the possibility of India perhaps becoming a potential mediator in the conflict. But India too, Brazil also gets mentioned, China too. The Russians have made it clear that they are prepared to talk. They reiterate again that at the moment, no talks are in fact taking place. That is what the administration could do. That is what the Europeans could do. They're not prepared to pay the price for it, nor for the moment, or so it seems, is the Zelensky government in Ukraine. And as a result, the trends continue downwards. Well, that is the situation with the Ukrainian conflict today. Lots of other things are taking place in the world. Firstly, President Putin is now, as I'm making this program, in the United Arab Emirates. He's having meetings in Abu Dhabi with the government of the UAE. He's speaking to the president of the UAE. I've discussed on many occasions why, in my opinion, President Putin has been careful to limit his foreign travels. The true reason why he didn't go to South Africa, for example, for the BRICS summit in August, was not because he was seriously worried that he would be arrested if he went there, and wasn't the reason why he didn't go to the G20 summit either. It's because he's afraid, he's worried, or rather his officials, his security officials are worried that Western governments might try to interfere with his flight. And we had a demonstration of this over the course of Putin's visit to the UAE. And I understand he's going to visit Saudi Arabia directly after, because President Putin's presidential jet was escorted throughout its travel by Russian Sukhoi 35 fighter jets. It had a military escort in order to prevent any interference by American Air Force assets in the area. And of course, we know that the Eisenhower is present in the Persian Gulf. And of course, he's got fighter jets, and there's US fighter jets in Qatar and other places. A US attempt to try to force down President Putin's plane and, in effect, to arrest him. So the Russians protected themselves from that possibility by providing President Putin with a fighter escort. And this fighter escort would have had to cross Iran and the Central Asian states, and it accompanied him all the way to Abu Dhabi and to Saudi Arabia. But it does mean that Putin is now restricted in where he can travel, either to countries directly contiguous with Russia, which do not pass NATO-controlled airspace, or to countries within the range of Russian fighter jets based in Russia itself. Just saying, just wanted to make that point. I had some pushback on this. People telling me that there's no conceivable way that the Western powers would interfere with Putin's presidential jet. Well, we see that the Russians clearly think otherwise. Anyway, Putin is there in the UAE. He's going to discuss oil and energy and all of these things, and bilateral relations between Russia and the UAE, which is, of course, about to join BRICS. And he's going to go on to Saudi Arabia, which is also about to join BRICS, and he's going to have discussions about all of these topics, oil and all that as well. And his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has just had a meeting with the Iranian foreign minister. And then next week in Moscow, Putin has a summit meeting with the president of Iran, Ebrahim Raisi. So all of this diplomatic activity. But of course, the situation in the Middle East remains a major priority. And we see that even as the Americans plead with the Israelis to exercise restraint in their military campaign in Gaza, the Israelis appear to be paying no attention. Prime Minister Netanyahu's government continues in exactly the way that it has done before. We have the same level of bombing, the same military operations in southern Gaza that we saw in northern Gaza. And there's been more and more reports of more and more people dying over the course of this operation, even as Hamas itself continues to remain intact. Now, let me repeat again. If this thing were to play out indefinitely, if the Israelis were to given all the time that they need or want, they would undoubtedly achieve a success in Gaza. But they don't have indefinite time. If you want to get a sense of how you can win a battle and lose a war, a good place to go is a film that was made in the 1960s called The Battle of Algiers, which showed the French military operation to gain control of the old town of Algiers during the independence war against France, which Algerian insurgents, revolutionaries, freedom fighters, independence fighters fought against the French in the 1950s and 1960s. And you will see, if you see that film, and it's fairly close to the realities of the actual events, that the French used extreme methods to gain control of Algiers. They were militarily completely successful, and in the end it availed them nothing. They lost the political battle. They suffered a strategic defeat. The FLN, the insurgent force, the independence force, remained intact, and of course it won, and Algeria became independent, and the FLN became the government of independent Algeria in the end. And it seems to me that events in Gaza are at a much more intense and violent scale, following something like the same course. And there are people who are becoming increasingly concerned about this. And we see this on the part of the US government. You see Secretary Blinken wringing his hands almost with the Israelis, trying to plead with them to moderate their stance. And we see at the same time how the Russians, and behind the Russians always are the Chinese, acting gradually, steadily, incrementally to improve their diplomatic position in the Middle East. And I noticed that my old friend, Simon Tisdall, appears to have had something of a moment of revelation, because he admits that the situation in the Middle East is now trending badly against the US. He's written a long piece. I'm not going to read it. Much of it contains the usual bizarre assertions that you tend to get from Tisdall. At least I find them bizarre. He speaks of Biden, for example. He actually calls Biden at one point, at heart, a decent and honourable soul. I'm not going to comment about that. But he does admit that Biden gave Netanyahu and the Israelis what was, in effect, a carte blanche. And he says that this is creating a disastrous situation for the United States in the Middle East, and that the situation is in danger of destroying the American position in the Middle East and also undermining President Biden's own prospect of re-election. Now, at some point, there's going to have to be a resolution to this. Either President Biden and the administration do assert themselves, and that is what people like Simon Tisdall are now demanding, or the situation in the Middle East will continue to deteriorate. And of course, as we know from Gideon Rachman's article, there is growing frustration in Washington that a good part of the US fleet is now tied down in the Middle East, even as China continues to strengthen its positions in the Asia Pacific. Well, we will see what the Biden administration eventually decides to do. Simon Tisdall, I notice, says that Biden needs to be less of the sympathetic uncle, less of soppy Joe. That's his other term for Biden. He needs to be more the hard-headed paterfamilias and superpower commander-in-chief. The idea that Biden could be any of these things, I have to say, seems to me extremely unlikely, but perhaps someone in the administration will finally make the decision for him and advise him as to what it is that he needs to do. But anyway, to repeat, with every day that passes, the strategic defeat that the United States is suffering in the Middle East, which Lloyd Austin talked about the other day, gets worse, and the diplomatic pieces are moving. Putin is in the UAE, he is in Saudi Arabia, he is going to be meeting Raisi very soon. He is in continuous contact with the president of Egypt. Egypt and Saudi Arabia are said to be working together. The war in Gaza continues. There was some word at the beginning that if Israel marched into Gaza, Hamas might collapse pretty much instantaneously. It didn't happen. They are putting up a fight in Gaza. Time is not unlimited, and it is ticking away. And with every day that passes in this conflict, not only are more people in Gaza killed, not only is more destruction taking place there, but the political and geopolitical balance in the Middle East shifts further against the United States, and the prospects of a massive embarrassment at the level of the General Assembly and the Security Council grows. So that's my program for today. More from me soon. Just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also check out our shop. Buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again for joining me today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.